Good morning or good afternoon, and welcome to this webinar, WHODrug SDGs Users Perspective. If you are listening in on this session on Tuesday, the 12th of November, we're broadcasting live and direct from Uppsala in Sweden. We are also recording this session and broadcasting it on Wednesday, the 13th of November. So if you're listening to that session, of course, a welcome to you guys as well. If you are joining us live today, we'd of course like you to interact with us. So that you could do by typing your comments and questions in the questions log throughout the session. You can also find the handout from today's presentation within the handouts panel of the control panel. Or you can also download the slides from the webinar's library from the UMC website. And those slides, they will be available around or within 36 hours after the webinar. So, who are your presenters today? Well, my name is Daman Fahimi. I work as a product and outreach manager here at the UMC. I have a Master's of Science in Pharmacy, and I've been working here at the UMC for around 7-8 years by now. Together with me today, I'm very pleased to have Olof.
Hello everyone, my name is Olof Laglund and I work as a substance expert here at UMC. I also have a background as a pharmacist as Daman, and I also have a PhD in medicinal chemistry. And I've been here for 4 years approximately, and I work with maintenance of WHODrug, but a lot with substances and SDGs. And now?
So we're very glad to have you here, Olof. Olof is a true SDG expert. We're also actually really pleased to have something special for you today, namely a guest speaker. So Danielle Ryan from Vertex Pharmaceuticals. Danielle, can you hear us?
I can. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Danielle Ryan. I work at Vertex Pharmaceuticals. I have been here for a very long time, 16 years about. I've been coding for about 20 years in WHODrug and Medra. But yeah, I'm a principal medical coder here at Vertex, and I manage many studies in different therapeutic areas, in addition to being a member of the Dictionary Advisory Committee that we have here.
Fantastic, Danielle, and we'll hear a lot more from you later. Thank you for joining us today. So the outline of today's presentation. We'll take a look at some of the basic facts of the standardized drug groupings and also some of the new things that's going on. Before we will look at a survey which we have conducted, so we'll do a high-level look of the results of that survey. And then today's highlight is, of course, a user presentation from Danielle about her experiences with the WHODrug SDGs. In then we'll have time for questions and answers. So again, please type your questions in the questions log throughout today's session, and we'll try to do as many as possible of those within the time frame we have today. So with that said, Olof, please take it away and let us know what is the basics and the news with the WHODrug SDGs.
Thank you, Daman. I will try to do a thing. Let's start with the real basic, the definition. What is an SDG? Well, SDG is short for standardized drug grouping, and the definition is that any grouping of medicine having one or several properties in common. And these properties can be any property of interest, for example, indication, chemical structure, pharmacodynamic or pharmacokinetics. And another important thing about SDGs are that they are user-driven. They are created and maintained by the UMC, but it's you guys who comes with the suggestions and helps us create them. They also they provide an unbiased search strategy for the coded data, and that's the real purpose with it. Today, as in the 2019 March release, we have 47 main SDGs. You can see all the groupings here, and they can be based on different properties. For example, the benzodiazepines, number 12, is based on structure. Then you also have the drugs interacting with CYP that are based more on a pharmacokinetic. And you can also have indication-based, like number 36, drugs used in diabetes. Apart from these 47 main, we also have a number of subgroups within these SDGs to make it a bit more refined. And let's take a look at the structure of the SDGs principle. It can be refined using subgroups and scope. I won't mention scope that much today, but this is there, and you can read about it in the user guide, which you will be presented later. An SDG is something that's based on a common property, as I said. And to be able to refine it, we use the concept of subgroups. And these subgroups can be viewed as a SDG in themselves as well. But to further refine an SDG is to use subgroups within subgroups. And when we have all these subgroups and define them, we fill them up with substances. So the substances are part of the subgroup that is in the lowest level, or if you could say that. But it doesn't mean one substance can be part of many subgroups or many SDGs. It's just it has to match the inclusion-exclusion criteria for the respective subgroup or main SDG or something. So it's not constricted to be in only one. However, an SDG doesn't have to have subgroups at all. The substance can be immediately under an SDG as well, as you can see for the corticosteroids SDG. And all these have scope, as I mentioned, and its default is narrow, but sometimes it's usualized, but not in all of them. Let's see. SDG versus ATC. The ATC, as you may know, is the anatomical therapeutic chemical classification that's made by the WHO Collaborating Center in Oslo for drug statistics and methodology. And it's a very good classification that we use in WHODrug. And but sometimes it doesn't really get all the aspects of a drug grouping that you would like. So we have a few examples when it's a good idea to maybe look at the SDGs compared with the ATC. For instance, the corticosteroids that I showed earlier, they include substances from many different ATC codes, which make it a good SDG to collect all of them. Another example is about one substance, imatinib, that you can see it's an antineoplastic tyrosine kinase inhibitor, and it's used in treatment of cancers. And the ATC code, it's very fitting because it's a protein kinase inhibitor in the LO1XE class, so it fits right. But if you compare it to imatinib in the SDG, we have it in 14 different groups. For example, in the PGP substrate, and it's also anti-genetic drug. So you can have one drug can be part of many different ATC codes. Oh, sorry, many SDGs. So that's one of the good things about it. But now we come to another basic thing, when to use them. It's all great to have a grouping, but you have to use them sometimes as well. But imagine if we have a clinical trial. This is one example. So, and when can you then use the SDGs? Well, let's start with the planning of the phase of the study. We could use the SDGs in the pre-qualification process when selecting which patients to include or exclude in a particular clinical study. For example, you might exclude patients taking a special group of drugs, like the corticosteroids. And then moving on, the SDG could also be used during a clinical study. For example, the SDGs could be used to prohibit the medication list, to detect protocol violations or milder protocol deviations during a special clinical study. And it can also be used in a way to prepare when regulatory authorities, for example, FDA, require more data after the study has finished. Based on the study population receiving certain comments, for example, all patients on anticoagulants. However, one thing to remember before using any of the SDGs is to read the user guide. Here you can find general points to consider about the SDGs, but you also find the specific details of the different groupings. What's the inclusion criteria, the exclusion, what's the scope, any other thing, are umbrella included, is herbal in there, and other important issues. And you can find a user guide in Insight or in at UMC Web at the document library, or it should be in the files as well that you can download when you download SDGs. And now that was the basic. It was really fast basic. So now we're going over to the news. And as you may know, or that all major changes for SDGs are made for the March release, like new SDGs or new subgroups or major changes such as those. So this March, it was 47 main SDGs and in a total of 471 drug groupings with all the subgroups. And the new things for the March was the anticonvulsants SDG. I'll get back to these a bit more in detail later. We also made subgroups in the diuretics SDG more granular, and we altered and added subgroups in the cancer therapies. Let's start a quick overview of anticonvulsants. In the new main SDG, it's mainly contains based on chemical properties. It's mainly used for drugs used in epilepsy, but also included if you have drugs used for other convulsive diseases, not just epilepsy. The diuretics, there were some new subgroup level 2 groups. The potassium sparing diuretics and thiazides and low saline diuretics were divided to make it more granular. Another thing we changed was that the other diuretics used to contain vasopressin antagonists, but vasopressin antagonist is now a subgroup of its own instead, and other diuretics are like other. It's good to keep in mind that it can change over time. And then we have the cancer therapy, where we added the endocrine antineoplastic therapy. We moved that from the immunomodulator SDG because it fitted better with the cancer therapies. And we also added a number of new targeted anti-cancer drugs subgroups on level 2. Another new thing for the SDGs is that we have added references in Insight. So now you should be able to look at all the why as drug is included. And this is to increase transparency of what's included and why. And I'll get back to if you don't agree later on. We also have an ongoing development now for the March 2020 release in WHODrug, and there are at the moment, or there are 2 new groups that we're working on: pulmonary arterial hypertension. Drugs against PAH can be found in several ATC groups, and that's why an SDG could be a very valuable thing. We also have a request to have either the whole WHO model list of essential medicines or parts of it, and that's to keep track from a pharmacovigilance perspective on this. It's ongoing work, so we shouldn't say too much more, but if you have an interest in these groupings, so feel free to contact us, and yeah, we are open for views. The SDG working group. I would like to say a few words before leaving the SDG development about this. It consists of users of the SDGs. It suggests new SDG development. It reviews inclusion and exclusion criteria. And the main thing is that even if UMC creates and maintains them, it's the working group that really decides, because we are not the users at UMC, at least not the ones in WHODrug who's making them. So we listen to you. What do you need? Because that's the important thing for them to be use driven. I can always come up with fun, nice groupings, but if no one uses them, then there's no idea to have them. And if you want to join, please send us an email and we can take it from there. You don't have to join to be able to ask for a certain new SDG or a grouping that you're missing or want to have. It's and you don't have to be an expert in the field of drugs. You can be just get the order from somewhere else that you need it. So, and then one last slide at least before. It's question or comments. Like, you may miss a substance in the SDGs, or you don't really agree with our conclusions. And now we have the references. You can see our conclusions a bit easier. Don't hesitate to let us know, and we will try to see what we can do about them.
And
Yes.
how do you contact the UMC if you have questions?
Yes, you can email us by WHODrug at who-umc.org. That's the best way. Otherwise, you will get our personal contact addresses in the end as well, I think. And yeah, I'll answer either way. And I think that's all for me now. And I'll hand over the mic to Daman.
Thank you, Olof, for providing this truly helpful overview of the WHODrug standardized drug groupings, as well as what's new. That's what's great. So now let's switch focus a bit and focus more on exactly how users are utilizing our WHODrug standardized drug groupings. So a couple of weeks ago, we actually sent out a survey requesting feedback on just that, your experiences of using WHODrug SDGs. And the aim with this was to use the results from the survey in our continuous work with the drug groupings, making sure that they meet the users of WHODrug's needs. So as of today, we have received well over 200 answers to the survey, which we are very grateful for. A big thank you to all of you who have responded to it. So if you did not get the email, or if you just forgot about taking the survey, we will be posting the link to the survey in the end of this presentation. So it's definitely not too late to fill out the survey and provide us with your valuable feedback. And while we, of course, will make sure to take a deeper look on the data collected within the survey, I thought it would be nice to kind of show you a high level review of the results that have come in so far with you. And maybe some of the results might even inspire you to start using the SDGs or find new use cases for the SDGs within your organization. So the first question that I'd like to show you the answers to, or the survey answers to, is related to what types of drug groupings that are being used. So according to the survey, the most commonly used type of drug groupings were the WHODrug SDGs, used as is without any modifications. With that said, we see that some users are also utilizing customized drug grouping based on WHODrug SDGs, but also CDGs built from scratch. We also asked in what more specific how your organization has made use of the WHODrug SDGs. And as you can see, clinical trial is the most commonly used case for using WHODrug SDGs, but they are also being used in post-marketing safety. We also had a few respondents saying that they are using the SDGs for IDMP related coding, submission relevant analysis, and to handle real world data. On the same note, we also asked respondents to elaborate on the most typical use cases. And here I am displaying the free text result as a word cloud. So as you can see, some of the most frequent words or expressions mentioned were protocol violations, prohibited meds, analysis, prohibited medication clinical, prohibited medications, exclusion criteria, listings, safety analysis, and drugs interest. We also asked for the most commonly used SDGs within your current organization, and this was the response. So an interesting point was that a majority of the SDGs available were actually mentioned in the survey. And that could be indicating that a broad coverage of the SDGs might be an important aspect of the SDGs and something that we should look after, so to speak. If we look at the top 5 list of the SDGs that seem to be most used, we see SDGs such as the CIP SDGs, corticosteroids, cancer therapy, anti-infectives, and also the PGP SDG that we have. So we haven't really talked about this today, but the WHODrug SDGs are available via different platforms or files. So you can find the SDGs available in WHODrug Insight. You can find text files for implementation within your coding tools, for example. And you can also find the SDGs in an Excel spreadsheet. Please note, though, that we are looking into removing the possibility to access the SDGs in the Excel spreadsheet, as this file is getting bigger and bigger for each release of the SDGs. And also the SDGs could actually be extracted in Excel format from WHODrug Insight directly. So as you see from this result, most users seem to access the SDGs via WHODrug Insight, but also the text files and the SDG Excel spreadsheet is used to some extent. We also asked respondents to the survey to rank to what extension they agreed with some predefined statements. So the first statement was whether the quality of the WHODrug SDG is good enough. And as you see here, the average of 3.92 says that yes, it is. It's good quality. The next statement was I can find the drug groupings I'm looking for within the WHODrug SDGs. And again, an average of close to 4, a bit lower than on the previous slide. And remember that for us, it's really, really crucial that you do let us know if there is a specific SDG missing. And this is something you can do, for example, by sending us an email. We also asked if the WHODrug SDG has any value to your daily work. And again, a high average here says that yes, you do see the value of the SDGs in your work. As Olof stated earlier on, there is an SDG user guide available, and many of you do find that user guide helpful in your daily work as well. Finally, we asked if you would like the UMC to develop a best practice for drug groupings. And I do think that this was one of the most clear answers received within the survey. So yes, you would like us to develop a best practice for drug groupings. So this is definitely something that we will have a deeper look into with the help of the users, of course. So thanks again, all of you who did respond to this result, and this was just a few of the questions. So we will of course do much more analysis and work on the answers that we got. And again, we will share the link to the survey in the end of this webinar. So now it's actually time for today's highlight, the user presentation from Danielle Ryan at Vertex about her experience of WHODrug SDGs and drug groupings. So I will try to hand over to Danielle here, and we'll see if we can get Danielle's slides up on the screen. And then whenever you are ready, Danielle, we're all yours. So we can see your slides right now, actually, Danielle. So please take it from here.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Thanks for asking me to speak. I hope that everybody finds this useful. Well, my control does not want to work to advance the slide. Give me 1 second. There we go. This is just a general disclaimer that my opinions are my own. I've been at Vertex for quite some time, so all of my examples in this presentation are created based on my experience. I am speaking for myself. I'll also say that my role has largely been based in clinical trial coding, so my perspective and examples relate to that accordingly. However, similar principles would apply for using SDGs or CDGs on safety or post-marketing data. A little bit about our current state. We aren't using hundreds of SDGs or CDGs. I think there may be companies who use more than we do. But right now, we are using about 15 standardized drug groupings inclusive of sub-SDGs, and those obviously are used for searching preferred names in our data. We used to have more custom drug groupings than we currently do. We've retired a bunch, but we have one that we're currently using and maintaining. These we formally develop, maintain, and version control. We have a committee that oversees this process. And for our custom drug groupings, we develop, most of them have been developed at a preferred name level, but we did have one that was drug name or trade name based. And we typically develop these by looking at ingredients or substances of interest, or we can often use ATC-based searches and add them to a CDG. And then we have something called informal searches, which are essentially like custom drug groupings. We have about 5 currently in use. They're intended for limited use, kind of for ad hoc internal requests or non-regulatory use, so they just have less formal controls about the development and maintenance. An example of that might be a request that comes in for a particular trial, and it's not going to need to be maintained over time because that trial is locking before we would need to upgrade it. So most likely it's not just one function that's impacted by development or use of dictionary tools such as SDGs or CDGs. You could have stats programmers, physicians, coders, data managers, clinical pharmacologists that may all have a part in the use of these tools. It is helpful to have controlled processes for tasks that can be supported by the use of such tools, and also processes that specifically govern the development and use of those tools, especially if they're going to be version controlled and maintained over time. Because of the cross-functional impact, I recommend cross-functional oversight of dictionary management and use of those SDGs and other searches. And that could be in the form of a committee dedicated to dictionary issues, or just specific functional experts on dictionaries. We've definitely learned over time that we need subject matter experts in several functions across the organization to be successful in doing this kind of work. Ongoing evaluation of technology or other resources, for example, programming resources that you might have available to you is important. Technology is improving all the time. Some more sophisticated coding tools, especially now, allow users to build custom groupings and apply SDGs and custom groupings to data in real time. If that's not something that's available, it's just important to define how you'll utilize other approaches to build, maintain, and apply that to your data. I've used the WHODrug Insight browser to build custom groupings. It's a very helpful tool. It's really easy to export files. So it's just one step of it. Though it's also important to think about proper storage of what gets built, and ultimately how that's applied to your data and how those things are maintained over time. In terms of storage, I have just a few examples here of how searches might be stored for retrieval by those who want to apply them. As I mentioned above, a coding tool could also be used as a repository. It's also important to consider who has access to these tools, who has access to the supporting documentation that comes along with those tools. Very important. Are the people pulling these and using them trained on the dictionary? So they really know what they're working with. Lastly, are there efficiencies that you can realize in terms of automatic storage of these types of things? Is there a central location where everybody knows to go to pull things? When you get the dictionaries, when you download a new version, are SDGs, for example, is there an automated process you might be able to implement to just get them in a certain location upon download of the file? Requests for custom drug groupings could come from a variety of people for multiple reasons, and it's important to fully understand the request in terms of intended use and the criteria on which the grouping should be based. Some examples of source criteria could be your protocol, certainly. In my experience, there has also been kind of a more specific document called a study restrictions document, which I'll talk about a little more later. An investigator brochure, maybe there are some data review specifications that data management puts together that include some checks around looking for specific medications of interest, and obviously any ad hoc and regulatory requests as well. Ideally, a WHODrug expert is included in reviews of some of those documents such as protocol, study restrictions, or manual data review, so that input can be provided as to what's even feasible to programmatically identify. So if somebody has knowledge of what SDGs are available or what custom drug groupings are available, it can be very easy to look at that criteria and understand what we can do and what we can't do. If we don't have something that works, that already exists, then at that point, it's really great to be able to get an early jump on planning for a possible custom search. So a dictionary expert or somebody familiar with SDGs is definitely instrumental in helping teams to understand the scope of an SDG and any potential limitations or considerations for its use. So once you have the criteria and you understand the intended use, you would look for what already exists that might suit the needs of the request. When evaluating what the options are, be sure that the scope and considerations for use fit the request. I've learned that it is not wise to simply look at the name of an SDG or even a CDG and call it a good fit. The SDG user guide is an invaluable resource. I would suggest creating similar documentation for any custom searches that you build. It's also important to note that criteria may go beyond just looking at what coding is assigned. There could be other variables such as route of administration or dose that you might need to factor in. So you may need to program around that. Just applying an SDG or a CDG as is may not be sufficient. Lastly, confirm and document all of the factors that go into making these decisions. As I said earlier, suggest creating similar documents like the SDG guidelines for any custom searches. And if you're combining SDGs together or CDGs, definitely document the approach that you're taking. It's not uncommon to end up with a combination of searches to satisfy one request. And so for the rest of this talk, I'll refer to that resulting plan on how to go about satisfying one request as an approach. So I have two mock examples that I put together, which hopefully will illustrate how one might go about creating an approach to identify certain medications of interest. These scenarios represent different purposes and different methods for building that approach. In this example, a team is looking to understand how many subjects are taking different types of hormonal contraceptives. So request may come in. Can you help us identify subjects taking hormonal contraceptives? This seems potentially easy, especially if you've been coding for a long time and you're familiar with ATCs. You know that there are categories for hormonal contraceptives for systemic use, among other potentially relevant categories. But in this case, that didn't suit how they really wanted to, how you really want to pull out this data. This example also illustrates, depending on who's asked to help with the task, you might get a different response in terms of approach. You might have somebody who's really familiar with ATC and gives you a method using ATC, or you might have somebody who's very familiar with SDGs only, and they look in there and they say, oh, this is perfect. In this case, you might end up with a combination of the two, so it helps to have somebody with knowledge of both. So there is an SDG. There are two sub-SDGs for estrogens and progestogens under SDG hormone replacement therapy. So that would be a good place to start. There's also, because there's interest in looking at IUDs and IVDs, you can look at ATCs that help you pull out those specific types of products in combination with using the SDG. I've seen scenarios where similar requests are submitted to and from different functions. So, medical monitor could request something from a study team for medical review purposes at the same time. A data manager, knowing that there's interest in identifying those meds, might ask their department programmer to put something together for review or cleaning purposes. If requests are filtered through common resources, consistency can be achieved for both purposes. But in any event, In this scenario, it is desired to identify all subjects taking hormonal therapy and then further separate them into categories listed there. So this can be achieved by using the SDGs to identify all of the subjects and then further break out subgroups for subjects taking medications that exist only in estrogens, SDG, only in the progestogens, SDG, and then subjects who are taking medications that exist in both. And then to further identify hormonal IUDs and additionally consider route of administration, you look at whether the product is linked to the ATC categories shown here, so contraceptives for topical use. So we use the route of administration and whether the preferred name links to this ATC to understand hormonal IUDs or IVDs. And one last note on this, it also helps to understand data collection practices for drug-based devices in this case. So for example, if we do collect procedural data and that it might typically be coded in MEDRA, it should be made clear that something like an IUD or IVD insertion, although procedural in nature and potentially appropriate for that form or CRF, if you know you're looking for this type of thing, you want to make sure you have a corresponding entry for that or have it moved to a different CRF as a medication so it can be coded and identified using WHODrug for the purposes of this search. Moving on to the second example, this is a possible approach for identification of prohibited meds for a study where there are multiple sources for criteria, multiple types of prohibited substances, and multiple search tools pulled together to create one comprehensive approach. In the case of prohibited meds, typically you'll find at least some high-level information in a study protocol, and that can give a solid start on what to look for in terms of SDGs, or if you have them, some custom searches that exist. But you'll notice that in these examples, there are some exceptions in language that is a bit more nuanced than what might be reasonable to just take an SDG or a CDG and apply it without looking at those other variables. So if we look at the first one listed, strong and moderate CYP3A inhibitors requirement, wonderful. This seems really straightforward. There are actually perfect SDGs that cover this nicely. But with the exceptions, programming may be needed around the exceptions noted. And you could do that based on drug code, for example, in the ciprofloxacin example, just remove that from the SDG. You could potentially create a modified SDG for this. I believe some companies use modified SDGs and custom CDGs. We do not use modified SDGs here. Or in the case of the topical substance allowance under the CYP3A inhibitor restrictions, you could exclude certain drug codes where the route equals topical in the data. And then also consider whether it might be appropriate to include unclassified categories. So the criteria is very straightforward. It says strong and moderate, and there are SDGs that fit that wonderfully, but there are also categories in the SDGs for substances that are not classified as strong, moderate, or weak. So it's important to have a conversation around whether it's appropriate to include the unclassified category in your searches. Regarding the second example, OAT-P1B1 substrate, in this language, there is the word sensitive. So there's no SDG that defines what, or information that defines what sensitive is. So this might be a company-specific perspective on this type of product. But there is an SDG for OAT-P1B1 substrate, so that's fantastic. In this type of example, you may want to think about whether you have some review of that SDG to see whether it fits the needs, or you may say, let's just use it. Whatever output comes out, we'll review that on a case-by-case basis. I would suggest at least having a look at any SDG before you use it. But if there's something like sensitive or that's not well defined, it's definitely a good idea to have a look and see what's in there and make sure it's a good match. The prednisone and prednisolone example shows that there are considerations for dose. Something about dose, I'm not sure if everyone collects dose on a CRF, so that could be challenging to program around depending on where the dose is collected and available to you. And one other consideration when you're looking at doing this as well is whether you're interested in looking at just single ingredient products based on a particular substance or multi-ingredient products, so any product that includes that substance. And then the last example here is for inhaled hypertonic saline. And this is a substance-based search, but it's important to note that all saline terms, hypertonic or otherwise, will map to the same TT of sodium chloride. So this is a difficult one in terms of doing the search at a preferred name level, and it may be necessary to do some searching based on the assigned drug name rather than preferred name to account for that, in combination with route of administration as inhaled if you have that information available to you. Another note around this, it relates to coding conventions. So it's a lot easier if you know you're going to have to be looking for hypertonic inhaled saline to understand how you're coding that data, or make a convention around how you're coding hypertonic saline solutions so that you know you're going to get what you're looking for once you try to retrieve the data with your search. I've seen cases where more specific study restrictions lists will be put together as a site resource, and essentially it takes the requirements of the protocol and gives specific examples or common examples of those categories. Those lists may not necessarily align with categorization of products in SDGs or CDGs. So you might have something that exists, and then it matches up nicely with the categories as described in a protocol or some high-level document, and then you get a very specific document with all kinds of substances listed, but they may not use the same logic as maybe an SDG or an existing CDG does. So in those cases, it's important to make sure that if you have a list of products, that those specific products do align with what's being developed for an approach. And if there are discrepancies between the two, it could be that the restrictions list that you're working with requires a correction, or possibly it's something we need to reach out to UMC on and ask for clarification on inclusion-exclusion criteria for a particular SDG, or maybe it's something that we missed in development of an internal CDG, and we would update, revise that accordingly. So once we fully understand the criteria and the searches that are available to us, including the scope and potential limitations from the user guide, SDG user guide, and any documentation that you have for custom searches, you can start to put things together. So this is what it might look like. In this approach, it's assumed that there's one prohibited medications output file of potential prohibited meds that's produced based on running the data against all of these different categories. So it's one program using all of the criteria. So depending on the needs, you could split it out to say, well, we want one output just for CYP3A inhibitors and so on and so forth. But for this example, it's all together. I mentioned earlier that some sophisticated coding tools could allow users to apply this to data within a tool for real-time results. To date, my experience has been mainly based on providing this sort of logic and approach to a programmer and having that programming performed outside of any coding tools. But again, like I said, technology is always changing and improving. In this scenario, if we can guide programmers to point to specific tools and searches, so if you have SDGs stored in a place or uploaded to a reporting tool, you can just tell them, and hopefully you have experts in the programming group, you can just tell them look for this SDG. You don't necessarily have to provide the list of terms associated with an SDG. So ideally, they have access to retrieve that information on their own. Then they would be responsible for maintaining record of that approach for their specific programming tasks. A full prohibited meds approach could be developed as a CDG. So there is an option to say, okay, I want to export all of these SDGs and combine them with the CDGs I know that we have, and I'm going to create this additional list of terms, which I'll explain, and create one huge file and provide it. That's something that in my early stages of using these, we did, but it's really difficult to maintain. It's a lot easier just to define the approach and the logic and send that to somebody who does the programming. It's very time consuming to do it the other way. So in this case, on the left, we have our SDG inclusions. I talked about unclassified CYP3A inhibitors in this example that was not included. The full SDG for OATP1B1 substrates is included. On the right-hand side, there's some custom work going in. So we have the custom drug grouping for hypertonic saline. And that is a little bit different programmatically because they're going to be looking at the assigned drug name and not the preferred name. And they're also going to take into account the matching route of inhaled. And this supplemental terms list is essentially what I talked about a little bit, where you have something, you know that a specific substance has been specifically called out as restricted because somebody feels that it fits into one of these categories. For whatever reason, that substance is not included in that category, or maybe there's just, 3 or a handful of items that they want included in the study restrictions list. So in those cases, you can develop just a list of terms that kind of supplements all of the CDGs and SDGs that you're using and provide that as a reference as well. That approach that's provided is run against coded data, accounting for all exclusions such as the ciprofloxacin that we talked about on the previous slide. And whoever's building this needs to make sure that there's guidance provided to programming and considerations for use, definitely documentation about how this is expected to be applied. So over time, custom searches will require maintenance, just as SDGs are upversioned and released with new WHODrug version. It's important to understand changes to SDGs as well within your organization. In terms of maintaining custom groupings, if they're not upgraded with new dictionary versions, it should be noted that if you use those and apply them to data that's coded in a different version, it's a use at risk scenario. So that should be documented as well. If there are standard programs that point to specific versions of SDGs or CDGs, those should all be updated as well. So it's an upversion of not just some custom drug groupings, but the programs that utilize those SDGs or CDGs as well. So that all requires very clear communication cross-functionally of dictionary upgrade plans so that people are well informed about the timing of when dictionary upgrade will occur, and so that functions can prepare to utilize the newest information. I did touch on the ability to utilize functionality inherent with certain coding tools, but depending on the complexity of the search, that might not be sufficient. And lastly, it's important to think about how these approaches or tools might be shared with partners or external teams. Consider that you might have varying levels of experience and knowledge in terms of requesting that searches be applied in a certain way, and that some training may be required. So lastly, just some lessons learned and key takeaways. I think for me, it's the most important thing. It's more necessary than ever to have dictionary experts in various functions. The STEPS programming groups, ClinFarm, medical monitors, safety, they all need to be aware of how these are developed, how they're intended to be used, how they should be applied to the data. This isn't just for medical coders and people who might be putting together searches. Transparency and training regarding processes and tools, definitely essential. In terms of transparency, I suggest a searchable shared space with supporting documentation and links related to whatever tools are available, readily accessible to anybody who might be trying to pick these up and use them. Let's see, document authors for things like protocols, etc., should understand the potential impact of their changes to existing approaches. So that's been something that has been valuable in training others to understand how their documents affect our work and having them get more understanding of the dictionaries and how everything works together. So I may have mentioned edit checks in this talk. My long history of coding within data management, I have more than once reviewed a manual data reviews pack that has specified WHODrug names based on a specific set of criteria. So it seems very simple when you're looking at trying to identify certain meds, but the dictionary is more complex than some people may realize. So again, getting somebody who has broad knowledge of the dictionary is really important. And then lastly, lesson learned for sure is that if it's possible to develop approaches to satisfy requirements across a program rather than doing things study by study, it will save a lot of time. Take advantage of whatever similarities exist. Take advantage of whatever standards already exist. Modify them if you need to. And that will save lots of work in the long run. And that's what I had. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danielle, for that great presentation. So with that, we have taken back presentation rights here. So we have come to the end of this session, meaning that we do have a couple of minutes left for a couple of questions. So before we get to the questions, and of course you can now start writing your questions in the questions log if you are listening to our live webinar today. Before we get to the questions, as I said before, we have done a SDG survey, and it's not too late to take the survey. So we're just now posting the link to the survey, the WHODrug SDG survey, within the chat. So we'd very much appreciate if you could take a couple of minutes of your precious time and fill that out for us, if you have not done so previously, of course. Thank you so much. So with that, it's time for a Q&A session. Danielle, I think we have one question for you here that I think you talked about to some extent, but could you just maybe be clear on how often do you update the customized drug groupings?
We upgrade them, so we upgrade WHODrug with the March release every year. And if we have custom drug groupings, we upgrade those as well at that same time.
Great, thank you. So we have a question here regarding a very specific use case, Olof. Is there any way another column could be added to SDG output to note only systemic drugs? For example, corticosteroids are often dermatological. Some DATCs are actually systemic. It's taking us a lot of time to review the SDG output to get only systemic preparations, which are often the only drugs which are of interest. So is that something that we could look into?
Yes, thank you for that question. It's a very good question, and it's quite a common one in different settings. If you know and been part of the SDG for a while, we had the systemic anti-infectives. But we removed that and called it anti-infectives, and it's the same thing with the corticosteroids. It's due to that when we do create SDGs, we base them on substances only, or the salt, but not on route, for instance. So one substance, if we add a substance, then all the multi-ingredients are always like, and all the products with that substance are automatically added to the SDG. And this means that we can't, when we create it and we include a corticosteroids as systemic, if it has some form, a package, one package that's sold as a dermatological, it's another form in a cream, then it's also included. So it's, I know that it can't really be done right as it is right now, but it's definitely something we would like to, because we know it comes up as a request from you guys. So good method.
Thanks, great comment. So unfortunately, our time is up. We've had our hour of looking into the SDGs from different perspectives. So we'd like to thank Danielle once again for presenting and joining us today. We'd also like to thank you all for joining this webinar. If you have any feedback for us, please do fill out the webinar survey that you will get after this session. You can also email either me or Olle or our dedicated WHODrug support. So with that, a big thanks from me and have a good continuance of your day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.